Happy 2023, everybody, and welcome back to the Sunshine State Rails. On January the 7th, 2023, me and a buddy of mine, Cooper, would make our way out to the Central Florida region on word of a rail train that had arrived in CSX's Lakeland Winston yard. The idea of seeing a rail train in action, coupled with the locomotive that was on power for the train, was very appealing to us, and so since we had the Saturday to play with, we figured we'd test our luck in Lakeland to see what would happen. And we'd actually get fairly lucky. They'd actually have a crew ready to take the train south from Winston Yard fairly shortly. So we'd sit around for a while under the southern yard entrance beneath the Polk Parkway to wait on the train. And as we're sitting here, we'll take a look at this map of CSX's Bone Valley. This is the region that we're going to be following this train throughout today. Everything framed here is the territory that concerns us. We're currently situated here at the south end of CSX's Winston Yard, from which this rail train will be shortly leaving southbound towards Mulberry.
On number 73984, 73984, 010723, KY856.0, W24307, 8662 Harris, copying. Circle line 1A, main track both directions. Between the NAS North Winston Yard on the main and the SAS South Winston Yard on the main. Over.
With their EC1 track authority in hand, W24307 would depart Winston Yard southbound for Edison Y. We wouldn't stick around as the train began to pull out because we'd have to get down to West Pipkin Road to set up for our next shot of the train at speed. Though leading would be CSX locomotive 8662 and EMD SD50-3, one of only 3 that I've confirmed to still be active on the CSX locomotive roster. By some chance and miracle, this one locomotive of 3 would make its way onto this rail train bound for CSX's Bone Valley. And with this locomotive still attaining a beautiful K5 LA horn and some slower ditch lights on deck, this was easily more than a treat and quite a way to start 2023. Now focusing on what 8662 is actually pulling, that would be a continuous welded rail train, meaning that there are no breaks in these strips of rail that you can see on the train, and they stretch throughout the entire consist across every car till the very end. This is how larger railroads like CSX transport and replace rail on their premium routes, as such big companies don't really use jointed rail much anymore, as continuous welded rail, while more expensive, pays for itself in lower maintenance costs. But the resulting process that comes with replacing that rail when it's time is very interesting. The rail is manufactured up north in steel refineries and then brought down by rail and unloaded by rail. The job of today's W243 would be to bring some of this welded rail down to CSX's Bone Valley where existing rail needs to be replaced. And that is what we'd be following today. Following the train southbound along Old Road 37 towards Mulberry, the train is coming up to Prairie Yard, which is a section of Mulberry Yard, though once they got down into the yard, they turned to the west to head out towards the siding of IMC. As we came through Mulberry, that's where we decided to go and set up next along Old Highway 60. This is that western section of Mulberry Yard that's separate from what's known as Prairie Yard, and in contrast to the purpose of this train and the majority of other places, jointed rail is still used here. And so that is shorter strips of rail bolted together to form the track instead of longer welded pieces like our train is pulling south today.
24307 dispatch, over.
243.
The IMC North Y out to like the 840.0 towards Edison. They need to do about an hour's worth of work to this rail out there around the Limehouse.
1 second, I get you fixed up. 8662, is that right?
So that is correct, over.
Alright, 1 second. south Y to the main, both directions, between the SAS, North End IMC, and the SVC 840.0 on the main. Over.
Is located 1149-1149, dispatcher SCM, copied by Harris, over.
Alright, we'll light you up to North End IMC. Here we go.
As 243 exits Mulberry Yard, he'll shortly be turning to the right to merge via the Mulberry Y onto the southbound Valrico subdivision. Nichols Road would parallel the Valrico subdivision down to our next setup location, which was, surprise surprise, Nichols, Florida. Nichols was in its heyday one of the Bone Valley's biggest phosphate mining towns, and unit trains of excess of 100 cars could be loaded and sent out of here on a daily or weekly basis. Though that's pretty much all gone now, and the only notable things that still stand in Nichols today are the post office and the Valrico subdivision running straight through, which would shortly be supporting W24307, a loaded rail train southbound for Edison. A little ways further down Nichols Road and we're stopped by our rail train again. Nichols Road weaves across the Valrico subdivision a few times, so I figured this was bound to happen. But at no point am I going to complain about being able to see this train pass us again. We don't often see welded rail trains in this territory unless it's a particular maintenance season, and I haven't seen many of these at all myself. But this would just be another stop and opportunity for us on our way down to Edison.
Well, how'd you say it's going so far?
Money.
Yeah, it's definitely a money train.
Getting money.
Probably costed a lot to get it here, too.
Money shots.
Quite the interesting set, must admit.
A few miles down the line further, and we are now at the front door of Edison. Parked on the side of Allen Road, we'd have a clear view of W243 standing motionless across what I believe to be the strawberry fields of this region. It may be hard to tell from this angle, but they've roughly positioned the center of the train with the road crossing of South County Line Road. Such denotes the entire reason for this stop. There's more than just the engineering conductor that goes into an operation like this where they have to take rail off the train and set it on the ground. There's a whole nother set of crew members that must get involved to complete such a task. Some in company trucks, some in backhoes, some to ride the train, and those to ride the train would be mounting the train at the road crossing that they've stopped at. There's an observation car in the center of the train and the actual unloader car on the bottom of the train. They'd have to load crew members onto both of those cars before they could start laying the rail down, and they'd also have to thread the rail through the bottom unloader car before they could do anything either. When everything was ready to go, they'd be laying the rail today through the south leg of the Edison Y, which would take a train off of the Valrico subdivision and onto the Brewster subdivision heading towards New Wales. From Edison Y, the New Wales phosphate processing facility is just a mile or two to our south. And to lay the rail around that south leg would require going over one road crossing, Allen Road. And this is where our crews and the backhoe come in. They'd close the road on both sides of the tracks and proceed to literally dig up the road. Now, for what reason would they do that, you're likely asking? When it comes time to lay continuous welded rail at the side of a track, they do not cut the rail for asphalt or road crossings. They will instead cut a trench in the asphalt and lay the welded rail in that trench until the other crews come to install the rail. So they'd have to have the backhoe out here to dig up the trench they had outlined in the asphalt. However, that wouldn't quite go as planned this morning. It appears that some track maintenance work within the last couple of years has required the asphalt around the tracks to have been replaced at some point, and so maybe it was for that reason, but this asphalt wasn't coming up cleanly in the trench they had outlined. It was instead pulling out major chunks that they wouldn't be able to do for the entire way across the road. And so after about 10 minutes of fighting with the asphalt, the decision was made to lay some ballast and dirt back in the hole that they had already ripped out, and the decision would be made to cut the rail for the road after all, because they couldn't dig up as much asphalt as they were likely going to with the way it was going so far. Though them cutting the rail for this road would actually make for its own unique spectacle. So after filling the hole and reopening the road, add another half hour to that time and the rail train crew was ready to bring it through and start dropping rail on the south leg of the Edison Y heading towards New Wales. And so with the chain linked up on the rear, the call was made to bring her through. Around the south leg of Edison Y, they'd slowly bring the train to a stop. This is where the train would have reached the position where they would like to begin unloading the rail at the bottom end of the train. So after getting the first rail rigged up at the bottom end of the train, they begin to roll ahead. And this is where things get interesting.
Nice and easy start. Alright, release 3 step, 8662. Head easy, here we go.
As they begin to roll forward, you may notice that as the entire train moves, this rail does not. With this rail having been rigged up at the bottom end of the train, rolling forward literally drags the rail off the train and onto the ground.
Up 5 to a stop. 5 more.
Such that becomes fully evident when the end of the train reaches us and we can see the bracing that is guiding this rail from its top rack down to the ground. Crews on the bottom unloader car carefully observe and control the positioning of the brackets as the train moves forward. And again, in relation to us, as the train moves forward, the rail does not, as it is literally being dragged off the train.
Get a stop, attention on the stop.
Though because they couldn't dig the trench in the asphalt earlier, they'd have to cut the rail for the road, which meant stopping just short of it and pulling out an oxyacetylene torch. The first time I've ever seen one of these in action, with 2 feeder lines for oxygen and acetylene, and to sear through the steel rail in under a minute. This torch reportedly burns at between 58 to 6,300 degrees Fahrenheit. While likely not the most convenient method for this operation, it's still a neat option to have in the back pocket, and is equally fascinating to watch. I have never seen crews of any kind cut through steel rails this quickly before. Once the first section of rail was on the ground, they'd sear another hole in the next section of rail as they'd have to pull across the road now and hook up a chain through that hole to the track. Unless you actually see this part of the operation, many instances would make it look like the rail is being mechanically pushed off the train by the brackets and rollers, though it's more of anchoring the end of a rail strip to a section of existing track and then pulling the train forward. The anchor keeps the end of the rail in place, and as the train rolls forward, the rail is pulled off the train and onto the ground.
You pick me up 1 mile an hour, listen for the man on the pan to count you down to a stop, over.
Alright, 1 mile an hour, here now.
It's a little bit fidgety when it first starts getting pulled, but once the weight of the rail settles on the ballast, it smoothens out. And so at 1 mile an hour, this is how they'd unload the rest of the rail around the south leg of Edison Y. And once they were done with this section of rail, they'd get to back up and do it all again.
15 for 15, Edison's clear. 15 cars.
As somebody who's seen a railroad track before may know, there are 2 rails that make up the right-of-way, not just one. So they'd have to go back to where they first started and lay another set of rails on the same side. So by that point, it was simply rinse and repeat. Back to the start, unload the first section, pull up to the road, cut through the rail with the oxyacetylene torch, and pull to the other side of the road before hooking up the last chain link and pulling out the last section of rail for today. So by the time all was said and done, 2 new sections of continuous welded rail would lie on the east side of South Edison Y. As the job of today's crews would not be to actually install the new rail, but rather just to drop it along the track for a crew that will replace it at a later date, whether that's 2 weeks from now or 6 months from now. As the crews finished dropping the last section of rail, I'd take a look at the 2 cuts that were made with our acetylene torch. They're not the cleanest cuts by any means, but certainly impressive, at least I think, for something that was able to make this cut in under a minute. And obviously when the replacement crew comes in here to actually install the rail, they'll likely fine-tune that cut with more precise equipment.
And that'll be good when you get it stopped, but exit on the stop.
When that final piece of welded rail hit the ground, it was time to call it a day for the rail train crew. And so that meant finding a spot to tie the train down until the next day. So what they would do, since they were already on a Y, since they had come around the south leg of this Edison Y, they'd shove the train up the north leg of the Edison Y heading towards Welcome Junction, and they'd tie the train down off the main in a siding that's known as Welcome Yard. So we'd set up about 400 feet to the west at the other Allen Road crossing to watch the shoving move.
20 cars to the crossing, we're going to stop and dismount a few and then pull back, stop and dismount a few more. Alright, understand.
It would also be during this shoving move that they'd periodically stop to drop off the ground crews from the rail train. As the engineer of today's train, who happened to be a distant friend of mine, would tell me afterward, the guys who actually work the rail train to drop it and cut it kind of end up making their own schedules. And that would concern us today because those guys just don't work at night. And because it was now after 3 p.m. and the sun would be going down in a couple of hours, it was time to call it quits, so they said. So up and around the corner, they'd bring W243 to Welcome Yard, where they'd tie it down for the night. Just north of the Edison Road crossing in Welcome Yard is where they'd tie the train down for the night, as the next morning they'd have some more rail to lay down by New Wales. But this would mark the conclusion of today's work for our rail train crew, and so Cooper and I, having not eaten pretty much all day, would head to our nearest Subway for a bite to eat. We'd see a few more trains in the area that evening, but it was about then that we decided to call it a night. So, what an interesting day that was. Chasing a rail train around the Bone Valley. That was my first time ever actually seeing a rail train lay down rail. It was a really neat, process to see how they perhaps failed at cutting asphalt and then, having to bolt the rail together and cut it too. But Cooper, what'd you think?
It was also my first time, and I thought it was pretty cool.
That's good.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I love Dakota, and he is great, and he is a good photographer.
Okay, we're getting a little too far here. We're getting ahead of ourselves anyway. But, yeah, just kind of a chance for us to get out together before he leaves again for, what was it?
College.
Well, where?
North Carolina.
North Carolina, exactly. So, It was a good way to do it, and to see 8662 on there, one of only a few SD50s that I know CSX has running around, so.
A good day. It's a good day.
It was a good day. Just an interesting day, kind of sporadic, but we found something in the morning to follow around, and I'm glad we did, because it was really neat, so. That said, hope to see you somewhere on the
Sunshine State Rails.
At least that's where we thought the day was over, but we'd be wrong. I would drive Cooper back to Plant City to pick up his car, and as we were exchanging our goodbyes, an incoming train horn would catch our attention from the north. And so he hopped right back in with me, and we headed over to Reynolds Street for another surprise train. With an ES40DC and an SD40-2, and I'm only including this train in the video because it was another continuous welded rail train, taking the near 90-degree connection from the southbound S line to the eastbound A line would be a WO13. While I believe this train originated somewhere in the Carolinas, it was bound for Winston Yard at Lakeland where we started this morning. And instead of routing the train down the arguably more direct Vitus subdivision from Vitus Junction to Lakeland, they opted to run it south from Vitus Junction to the connection here at Plant City, and then east from Plant City to Lakeland. Though that would all just happen to create the scenario where we'd be able to see this train crossing Reynolds Street in Plant City. This train, interestingly, would have a CSX shoving platform on the end of the train. These are often used for conductors to ride on and be the eyes of the engineer when trains like this one are making long reversing moves, though to see these shoving platforms in the form of old cabooses like this one nowadays is a diminishing sight across Class 1 railroads, and not all rail trains have these shoving platforms, as was evident with our train this morning that didn't have one. Once WO13 cleared, there would be no more surprises, and I was able to drop Cooper back off at his car, and we'd go our separate ways from there. Though I wouldn't take the traditional interstate routes from Plant City to home. Instead, I would take a back streets route that would actually take me back through the Bone Valley again. And since there was a full moon that night and I had the means to do it, I thought why not revisit our rail train down at Edison and get some nighttime long exposures beneath the full moon with our SD50. And so I'd put that final plan into action. So here we are, back at Edison Road with our rail train still tied down at Welcome Yard. But they didn't leave our SD50 to idle overnight for the next day's work. Instead, they must have shut it down sometime after we had left earlier that afternoon. Though there was something simply eerie about standing in the presence of this locomotive in the middle of the night, under nothing but the moonlight and only the step lights illuminated. This locomotive sitting here in front of me with no sound coming from it in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. Ultimately, I'd get my photos, but I don't know. There was just something eerily ominous about being in the presence of this train that night. Though right as I was preparing to head out, a headlight coming out of the darkness in the west caught my eye. It'd be one final surprise for the night. Though we've been following a rail train down here all day, we mustn't forget where we are. The CSX Bone Valley phosphate mining region, and their trains run all the time. This would be a train of empty wet rock hoppers returning from Mosaic East Tampa southbound for Ag Rock Yard on the Brewster subdivision. These hoppers will eventually be reloaded at the Four Corners phosphate mine with fresh wet rock to return to East Tampa. But tonight they'd be returning to Ag Rock under the full moon. And what a day trackside it was in CSX's Bone Valley, following a rail train with a one-of-a-kind leader and seeing them unload rail for the first time, at least for me, ever. I'd like to give a quick thank you to engineer Nick as well as the ground crews for this day's rail train for making a lot of today's shots possible and for just being so cool with us throughout the day. And also a quick thanks to all of you for watching. And so, until next time, in Keysville, Florida, this is Kotabeaner, and I'll see you next time on the Sunshine State Rails.